What if the point where history becomes readable is not the beginning of human complexity at all, but merely the first layer that managed to survive the passage of time? Most of us picture civilization as a steady climb. First people learned to grow food, then they formed villages, those grew into towns, towns expanded into cities, cities invented writing, and finally they raised monuments that still stand today. That familiar ladder feels solid, like a set of steps we can walk up in our minds. Imagine that ladder as a simple wooden staircase. Each step is made of a material that lasts a long time: brick, clay, stone. So the higher steps are the ones we still see. The lower steps, made of wood, hide, or spoken words, have long since rotted away. In that picture, the first visible step, writing, appears to mark the true start of civilization, and everything before it fades into darkness. Göbekli Tepe, a hilltop site in southeastern Turkey, shatters that picture. Archaeologists have dated the earliest stone circles there to around 10,000 years ago, well before the first cities of Mesopotamia appear in the record. The site contains massive T-shaped limestone pillars, each reaching up to 5 meters in height, arranged in circular enclosures that were clearly built by groups of people who gathered deliberately. No evidence of houses, streets, or a ruling elite accompanies the stonework. Instead, the area is surrounded by the remains of hunter-gatherer camps. The sheer scale of labour, carving, transporting, and erecting these monoliths demands an organisation that we normally associate with urban societies, yet the usual urban machinery is absent. If this mystery pulls you in, please like, subscribe, and comment your location. The surprise here is not that ancient peoples could move stone. That is a question of engineering. The surprise is that they coordinated enough effort to raise a monument before the social structures we think are necessary for such coordination ever appeared. Göbekli Tepe does not prove a lost empire, but it does prove that some form of shared purpose gathered people together far earlier than the standard model expects. That shift widens the investigation. Instead of asking who built the pillars, we must ask what already existed that could bring people together for a common task. Was there an early system of ritual gathering, a shared cosmology, or a seasonal meeting place that provided the glue needed for such cooperation? The stone circles become a pressure mark, a concrete contradiction that forces us to look beyond the familiar ladder. In the next part of our journey, we will lay out the investigative contract. We will define the what-if framework that guides this inquiry, and we will examine why the standard civilization model feels convincing even while it leaves gaps. By understanding the strengths of the familiar story, we can see where the pressure from Göbekli Tepe begins to crack it open. What if the first civilization we can read about is not the true beginning of human complexity, but merely the first layer that survived long enough for us to see? That question sits at the heart of our investigation, and answering it requires a clear agreement between us, the curious explorer, and the evidence that waits beneath the surface. Think of this agreement as a simple contract between fellow travellers on a nighttime hike. We promise to follow each clue wherever it leads, to question every comfortable assumption, and to let the facts, not our hopes, decide where the path turns. In return, the story promises to reveal something unexpected, a hidden step that reshapes the familiar outline of history. The familiar outline, the civilization ladder most textbooks teach, begins with the invention of farming, then the rise of villages, the birth of cities, the invention of writing, and finally the construction of grand monuments. This sequence appears logical. Food production makes permanent settlements possible. Settlements need organization. Organization produces record-keeping, and record-keeping celebrates achievement with stone and gold. Empires such as Sumer and ancient Egypt sit neatly on the top rungs, reinforcing the idea that each step inevitably follows the one before. Yet that ladder, solid as it looks, is only a partial photograph. It captures the parts of our past that were built from stone, clay, and metal, materials that survive for millennia. It leaves out everything that was crafted from wood, skin, fire, or spoken word, because those fragile traces simply did not last. The model is reasonable. It reflects the evidence that happens to be visible. But it is incomplete, a silhouette that omits the hidden shape of the crowd behind it. Because the model works so well with the surviving pieces, it also creates a blind spot. When we see a clear line of development, we tend to assume that nothing of comparable importance existed before the first written record. The very success of the ladder at explaining what we can see makes us less likely to look for the invisible steps that preceded it. In other words, the strength of the familiar story hides the possibility that earlier forms of organization, belief, and exchange were already shaping human lives. Our investigation will keep that blind spot in focus. We will follow a series of pressure marks, concrete traces that push against the ladder and force us to reconsider its lower rungs. Each mark will be examined on its own merits, and together they will form a pattern that either supports or challenges the idea that the visible beginning is the true beginning. By staying grounded in what the evidence can actually tell us, we avoid the temptation to fill the gaps with speculation. Now comes the next question that guides us forward. Why does the visible beginning of civilization feel so convincing? The answer lies not in the absence of earlier complexity, but in the way our archives were built. Durable materials such as stone and fired clay act like spotlights, illuminating only the parts of history that they can preserve. This visibility bias means that the first things we can read about, cities, writing and monuments, naturally appear to be the starting points, even if they are merely the brightest fragments of a much older tapestry. With that understanding, we turn to the next stage of our journey, where we will explore how preservation bias shapes our perception of the past, and why the earliest visible signs of civilization seem inevitable. The trail ahead leads us back to the hill of stone pillars, to the bodies that walked the earth long before them, and ultimately to the hidden archive that waits to be uncovered. You look at the first cities that history remembers: Sumer, the early river settlements, the stone walls of ancient towns, the baked clay tablets that recorded grain rations and king lists. Those surviving fragments give you the feeling that civilization began with organized streets, towering walls, and written law. The concrete anchor is simple. Stone and clay endure the ages, while wood, hide, and woven baskets vanish, so the record you can touch is already shaped like a ladder of urban development. Think of the past as a library that has suffered a fire. Only the stone-bound books remain on the shelves, while the paper scrolls and wooden tables have turned to ash. If you walk through that ruined library, you will assume the surviving stone volumes were the most important texts, even though the missing paper may have held the everyday stories of the people who built the shelves. That everyday analogy translates preservation bias into a term you can picture. The archive you see is a spotlight, not a full stage. The factual picture is clear. Baked clay tablets, such as those from Uruk, survive for thousands of years because firing turns the mud into a hard, waterproof material. Stone monuments, carved pillars, and fired bricks also resist decay, allowing archaeologists to map the outlines of early cities. In contrast, organic materials, wooden beams, thatch roofs, leather clothing, woven baskets, and even simple fire pits decompose within a few decades once they are uncovered. The evidence shows that the durable media you now study are a tiny fraction of what once existed. Because the durable items survive, they dominate the narrative you hear in textbooks. The interpretation is that the presence of writing and monumental stone indicates the moment when societies first became complex. Yet that interpretation rests on a bias. What lasts is what you can see, not necessarily what was most influential at the time. The hypothesis follows that many essential aspects of early human organization, seasonal knowledge, oral traditions, communal gatherings, and portable technologies could have been built on perishable foundations that left no trace in the archaeological record. This bridge clarifies the limitation. The visibility of stone and clay shapes your picture of the ancient world, but it does not prove that those were the first or only building blocks of civilization. The record you have is a spotlight that highlights certain actors on the stage, while the rest of the performance remains in darkness. Recognizing this gap changes the way you evaluate the early monument you will revisit. Understanding the bias matters because it opens a new question. What complex activities might have existed before the first stone walls, before the first written tablet, that simply did not survive? If you accept that the visible record is only a fragment, you begin to look for other kinds of evidence: burial practices, pigment use, and long-distance exchange that can hint at hidden organization. The value of this perspective is that it redirects your investigation from asking, "When did civilization start?" to asking, "What kinds of social systems could have flourished without leaving durable traces?" With that perspective set, you now return to the hill of Göbekli Tepe, the early pressure mark that challenges the durability-biased story. The stone pillars there stand out precisely because they survived the bias, that hides other earlier forms of collective activity. Let's examine how that site reshapes the narrative you thought was already solid. After exploring why the visible beginning of history feels convincing, we now step onto the hill that challenges that logic. The stone hill in southeastern Turkey bears the name Göbekli Tepe, a site whose very name means potbelly hill in the local language. Its most striking feature is a series of massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some rising to nearly 5 meters, arranged in concentric circles that form imposing enclosures. Radiocarbon dates from charcoal embedded in the surrounding layers place the earliest construction at around 11,000 years ago, deep in the pre-pottery Neolithic. Radiocarbon dating measures the decay of carbon in ancient charcoal to estimate how many years ago the fire burned. These pillars do not belong to a palace or a market street. They are monolithic, each hewn from a single block of limestone, drilled and carved with animal motifs, abstract symbols and deep incisions. The enclosures are bounded by low stone walls, and their interiors contain scattered basaltic beams that once supported wooden roofs. No evidence of permanent dwellings, granaries or administrative buildings accompanies the stonework, and no writing or clay tablets have been recovered from the site. To build such a monument, a community of hunter-gatherers had to divert time, food and energy from daily subsistence. Every day spent shaping a pillar meant one less day spent hunting, gathering wild tubers or repairing shelter. The labour required not only physical strength but also coordination among dozens, perhaps hundreds of individuals. In plain terms, the people had to agree to pause their ordinary survival tasks, gather together, and work on a project that offered no immediate tangible benefit like food or protection. The mystery, then, lies not in the engineering skill. Ancient stone cutting is well within the capabilities of pre-agricultural peoples, but in the social motive that could organise such collective effort. A city, with its markets, walls, and administrative elite, provides obvious incentives: trade, security, and authority. Göbekli Tepe lacks any of those hallmarks. There are no residential structures, no storage pits, and no signs of a ruling class. Yet the scale of labour suggests an already existing system of shared purpose, perhaps a ritual gathering place, or a communal memory anchor that drew people together across seasons. If the site does not represent a city, it still forces us to reconsider when complex social organisation first emerged. The pillars show that groups could coordinate large-scale projects well before the appearance of permanent settlements, writing, or state institutions. This reshapes our view of early societies. They were capable of collective planning and symbolic expression without needing the machinery of urban life. However, the stones do not prove the existence of a city, a kingdom, or a bureaucratic hierarchy. They merely indicate that some form of social cohesion was present, leaving open the question of what that cohesion looked like. What does Göbekli Tepe reveal about social organisation if it is not a city? And what questions remain about what the site does not prove? The first sceptical voice asks whether Göbekli Tepe can truly be called a city. Archaeologists have not uncovered defensive walls, permanent residential quarters, or any written tablets at the site. Those three features are the hallmarks most scholars used to define a city in the ancient world. What remains are the towering T-shaped limestone pillars, the circular stone enclosures, and the finely carved reliefs that decorate them. These elements demonstrate a remarkable level of coordinated labour, yet they do not provide evidence of streets, marketplaces, or a governing bureaucracy. A city, in plain terms, is a place where people live day after day, with streets to move between homes, shops to trade goods, and officials to keep records. A ritual gathering place, by contrast, is a spot where groups come together at specific times, share a common meaning, and pool their effort for a shared purpose. Göbekli Tepe fits the second description more closely. Its pillars rise from a hilltop, suggesting a focal point that people travelled to, perhaps seasonally, to perform communal activities. The carvings of wild animals and abstract symbols hint at shared stories or beliefs, not at administrative control. The absence of city markers does not erase the significance of the coordinated effort required to raise such massive stone pillars. Moving and erecting stones that weigh several tons demands careful planning, shared knowledge of quarrying, and the ability to mobilise dozens of individuals across many days. That collective labour indicates a social framework capable of organising people beyond the immediate needs of hunting and gathering. The question then shifts from how could they lift these stones to what already brought them together before cities ever existed. One plausible motivation is the desire for a communal sanctuary, a place where seasonal groups could gather, exchange stories, and reinforce social bonds. Such a sanctuary would provide a sense of identity and belonging that transcended the day-to-day survival tasks of a mobile lifestyle. If people already possessed a shared symbolic language and a collective memory of mythic beasts, the hill could have served as a physical anchor for that intangible world. In that sense, the monument becomes a social catalyst rather than a technological mystery. The site therefore expands the central question of this investigation. Instead of asking how a pre-urban people built a megastructure, we must ask what forms of organisation existed that could marshal labour, allocate resources, and inspire a common purpose before the emergence of permanent streets and written law. That line of inquiry pushes us back to the very bodies that lived long before any archive was ever created. To explore the roots of that organisation, we need to look at the earliest human remains we know. The fossils recovered from the Jebel Irhoud site in Morocco push the anatomical appearance of modern humans back well beyond the rise of agriculture, writing, and cities. Those ancient bodies provide a deep time anchor that helps us measure just how far the human story extends beneath the thin page of recorded history. By studying them, we begin to trace the biological continuity that underlies the social innovations seen later at Göbekli Tepe. The next step, then, is to examine those early humans themselves, to see what capacities they might have brought to the communal projects that predate any written record. The stone slab from Jebel Irhoud, perched high in the Atlas Mountains of Morocco, yielded a set of human fossils that have been dated to roughly 315,000 years ago. Those bones belong to individuals whose skulls already display the rounded forehead and chin that mark anatomically modern humans. The find is a concrete anchor that pushes the human story back well before any known record of writing or cities. Imagine a library that holds 100,000 pages, each page representing 1,000 years of human existence. The 315,000 years of Jebel Irhoud would fill more than 300 of those pages, yet the pages we can actually read today occupy only the very last few sheets of the same volume. This simple image shows how the vast majority of our past remains invisible, hidden behind a thin, readable surface. Scientists arrived at the age of the Jebel Irhoud remains using several independent techniques. Electron spin resonance dating of the surrounding teeth, combined with uranium series analysis of the flowstone encasing the bones, converges on the 315,000-year figure. The consistency of these methods gives confidence that the dates are not an outlier. Anatomically, the fossils possess a modern cranial vault shape, while still retaining some archaic features, a blend that signals a transitional stage in human evolution. Even with such precise dating, the bones alone cannot reveal the cultural practices of those people. No tools bearing distinctive marks, no pigments, no burial rites have been found in direct association with the skeletons. In other words, the skeletal evidence confirms the presence of Homo sapiens-like bodies, but it offers no glimpse into language, art, or organized memory that would have survived in an archive. That creates a striking contradiction. The human body has been walking the planet for hundreds of thousands of years, yet the written archive we can read begins only a few thousand years ago. The gap is not a mere curiosity. It is a structural hole in our knowledge, a missing page that forces us to ask what filled those silent centuries. Understanding that the visible archive is merely a thin surface changes how we view the early monument at Göbekli Tepe. The site may be impressive, but it represents only a flash of activity that managed to leave a durable imprint. The greater story lies in the centuries and millennia that never left stone or clay, reminding us that the record we keep is selective and incomplete. If bodies have been around for so long, the next question is how those early humans expressed meaning before any writing existed. Did they use pigment, shape objects, or mark their surroundings in ways that have survived only in subtle traces? Let us turn to the earliest evidence of symbolic behaviour, beginning with the red ochre processed at Blombos Cave, to explore how meaning may have been built long before the first page of history was ever written. Imagine a colossal book that stretches back through the ages, its spine forged from the countless lives of our species. Each leaf represents a span of time, and the whole volume contains the story of humanity from its very first steps to the present day. If we were to open that book, the pages we can actually read would sit at the very end, the last few sheets where ink has survived the wear of millennia. The earliest known writing appears around 10,000 years ago, carved onto clay tablets and bone. In contrast, the fossil record shows that anatomically modern humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years. That means the readable portion of our story occupies only a thin sliver of the total narrative, perhaps the final 300 pages of a tome that runs to 100,000. The contrast is stark. A single paragraph of recorded history set against a vast unwritten expanse. This thin, visible layer does not mean the earlier pages are empty. It simply means the materials we use for writing, clay, papyrus, parchment, preserve far better than the perishable tools, songs and gatherings that filled most of those earlier chapters. Wood, hide, firelight stories and seasonal rituals vanished long before they could be inscribed. The archive we inherit is therefore biased toward the durable, not the complete. The implication is profound. Hundreds of thousands of years of human activity, thought and social organization remain undocumented, hidden beneath the surface of the surviving pages. Those missing centuries form a silent archive, a reservoir of complexity that left few stone or metal traces. We can see the outline of a civilization, but the details of everyday life, belief, and innovation have been largely erased. Recognizing this hidden archive expands the mystery we began to explore with the stone pillars of Göbekli Tepe. It forces us to ask what evidence might survive when the usual record does not. If the final pages of the book are so limited, then the chapters that precede them must have left other kinds of marks. Marks that do not rely on durable writing but on other forms of expression. The next step in our investigation is to follow those alternative marks. The earliest clear sign of symbolic thought appears not in ink but in pigment. Roughly 100,000 years ago, people at a coastal site in southern Africa deliberately ground red ochre and mixed it with animal fat, creating a paste that could be applied to shells and tools. This ochre processing workshop at Blombos Cave represents a purposeful manipulation of colour long before any alphabet existed, a tangible hint that meaning was being shared and recorded in ways that stone and bone can still reveal. By turning from the thin, final pages of our written book to the deeper, colour-stained chapters of pre-writing humanity, we begin to uncover the hidden layers of the human archive. The journey now moves from the limits of the visible record to the earliest surviving traces of symbolic behaviour, inviting us to explore how our ancestors chose to make their world meaningful, even when the pages of history were still blank. On a hill in southeastern Turkey, the stone pillars of Göbekli Tepe stand silent. Yet a single ancient skull discovered far to the south tells us that humanity's story stretches back far beyond those monuments. The fossil, unearthed in the Moroccan mountains, dates to roughly 300,000 years ago, placing our species on the planet long before the first written records. That single bone is a reminder that the visible surface of history is only a thin slice of a much deeper story. Imagine humanity not as a single line drawn across a page, but as several branches growing side by side in a dense forest. In that forest, Neanderthals roamed the tundra and forested valleys of Europe and Western Asia from about 400,000 years ago until roughly 30,000 years ago. Their sturdy bodies and robust tools show a culture that adapted to cold climates, hunted mammoth herds, and crafted simple ornaments. Across the same millennia, Denisovans inhabited parts of southern and eastern Asia, leaving behind only a handful of finger bones and a few teeth, yet their genetic legacy persists in modern peoples of Oceania and Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, early modern humans, our own ancestors, were spreading across Africa and into the Near East, developing new forms of stone technology and social organization. All three groups overlapped in time, sometimes sharing the same landscapes, sometimes occupying neighboring territories. The coexistence of these distinct hominin species means that the human past was never a solitary march of one people. Each group carried its own traditions, languages, and ways of seeing the world. Because most of their artifacts were made from perishable materials, wood, hide, plant fibers, the archaeological record preserves only occasional stone tools, a few bone fragments, and occasional pigments. This scarcity creates a profound gap in the archive, a missing chapter that modern scholars must infer from the few surviving clues. When the record is thin, it is easy to assume that the empty spaces were empty, but the reality is that whole cultures vanished without leaving durable traces. The loss of these peoples explains why the early chapters of our story feel so fragmentary. If entire communities disappeared beneath the soil, Their songs, stories, and daily practices were swept away like footprints after a storm. The absence of written records does not mean the absence of meaning. It only tells us that the medium we rely on to read the past was not yet widespread. This realization forces a new question. What kinds of cultural expression might these vanished groups have created, and how can we detect them without stone tablets? Considering the breadth of the lost cultures reshapes our view of deep time. Instead of seeing a lone Homo sapiens walking alone across the landscape, we now recognize a chorus of hominin voices, each contributing to the tapestry of human evolution. Their interactions, competition, interbreeding, shared knowledge, add layers of complexity that the surviving stone record can barely hint at. The mystery deepens. What shared practices could have survived the ravages of time and material decay? One of the most persistent hints comes from a faint reddish residue that appears on shells and rocks at sites predating the first villages. This pigment, chemically identified as ochre, suggests that early peoples were deliberately processing and applying colour long before any form of writing existed. The next step of our investigation will follow that trace, asking how and why these ancient hands prepared pigment, and what that reveals about symbolic thought in a world without durable archives. Having seen how ochre was deliberately processed, we now turn to how early humans honoured their dead, revealing another layer of symbolic behaviour. The Kafsi site, nestled in the hills of what is now Israel, yielded a series of deliberate burials dated to roughly 100,000 years ago. The skeletons lay in shallow pits cut into the chalky ground. Around the bodies, archaeologists found ochre, a red pigment that required grinding limestone, mixing with water, and applying the slurry to the bones. Stone tools and a few fragmented beads accompanied the interments. These findings show that the community took time to prepare a material that had no practical survival purpose. The presence of ochre indicates that the people invested labour in a substance chosen for its colour rather than its utility. The graves also contain small collections of personal ornaments, suggesting an intention to treat the dead as individuals worthy of care. In plain terms, burying a person required hunters to stop gathering food, to dig a pit, and to apply pigment before covering the remains. That daily effort could have been spent on hunting, gathering, or shelter building. The choice to allocate that effort to a dead body points toward a desire to remember and respect the individual beyond their immediate economic contribution. The act of burial therefore functions as a form of memory. It creates a lasting physical marker that outlives the body, allowing later generations to encounter the site and infer that the deceased mattered to their community. This memory is preserved without any written symbols, no inscriptions, no tablets, no carved names. The record consists solely of the arrangement of bones, pigment, and modest grave goods. The contrast is striking. Labour was spent on a ritual that leaves no textual documentation, yet it leaves a Stone Age signature that we can still see. Why would a group invest such effort without the benefit of a written record to reinforce the act? The question pushes us to consider what purpose the burial served beyond the practical. What this burial demonstrates is that early humans possessed the capacity for collective remembrance before the invention of writing. It shows that symbolic behaviour, using colour, arranging objects, and marking a place, predated any known alphabetic system. It does not, however, prove that the community held a fully developed religion, nor does it reveal the specific beliefs behind the practice. The exact meaning of the ochre coating remains unknown, and the personal stories of those interred are lost to us. The lingering question becomes, how far did such symbolic gestures extend, and what other forms of expression might have existed that left no durable trace? From the burial we segue to the painted walls of Göbekli Cave, the next surviving visual record that continues the story of mind before writing. The walls of Göbekli Cave, tucked deep within the limestone cliffs of the Vercors Plateau in southern France, hold some of the world's oldest known paintings. Radiocarbon dating of charcoal pigments places the artwork at roughly 30,000 years ago, making the images older than the first settled villages. The panels are covered in vivid depictions of horses, lions, bears, and rhinos, rendered with fluid strokes of charcoal and ochre that flare like brief bursts of light across the stone. The figures are rendered with a level of anatomical accuracy and dynamic movement that rivals later prehistoric art, a clear fact of the cave's visual record. These paintings demonstrate that early humans were capable of sophisticated visual representation long before any system of writing could capture their thoughts. The choice of powerful predators and swift herbivores hints at a deep familiarity with the surrounding megafauna, an interpretation that scholars use to argue for a keen observational skill set among the artists. The technique of layering dark outlines beneath lighter washes suggests a deliberate attempt to create depth, an artistic decision that implies a conceptual understanding of space. Because the images survive without any accompanying text, they act like photographs that have endured while the stories behind them have vanished. In everyday terms, imagine finding an old family portrait that shows a smiling child but offers no caption to explain the moment captured. The art provides a striking visual snapshot, yet the narrative that once gave those images meaning is absent. This gap underscores a broader pattern. The archaeological record preserves moments of brilliance, while often erasing the surrounding context. What other stories or knowledge might be missing beyond the surviving paintings? If the artists recorded only what they could etch into stone, countless songs, myths and teachings could have been lost forever, leaving us to wonder about the full tapestry of their cultural life. The importance of this mystery lies in the coexistence of advanced cognition and silent archives. The Chauvet figures prove that symbolic thought and creative expression existed far earlier than the first written tablets, yet the silence of the walls reminds us that many aspects of those early societies remain unknowable. This tension between what we can see and what remains hidden drives the investigation forward. From the vivid animal scenes, we now turn to the hand stencils that follow them, personal imprints left on the same walls, offering a direct human signature that bridges the gap between visual art and individual presence. The dark interior of Chauvet Cave holds a simple yet striking imprint, a hand pressed into ochre-coloured stone, its 5 fingers frozen in time. This hand stencil dates to roughly 30,000 years ago, and identical marks have been found in Lascaux, Altamira, and more than a dozen other Upper Paleolithic sites. The archaeological record confirms that these impressions were made by blowing pigment around a hand placed on the wall, leaving a negative silhouette that endures while the surrounding art weathers. Think of the stencil as a prehistoric signature. Long before alphabets or nameplates, a person could announce, "I was here," with a single handprint. The gesture requires no language, no symbol, only the body itself. In everyday terms, it is the ancient equivalent of signing a guestbook with a fingerprint, a direct personal claim of presence that any later reader can recognize. The evidence shows that hand stencils are scattered across Europe, Africa, and parts of Asia, each confined to shallow, sheltered chambers where light could penetrate for a brief moment. Researchers have recorded upwards of 100 distinct handprints, each varying in size and orientation, indicating that multiple individuals contributed to the same walls over centuries. The distribution pattern suggests that the practice was not limited to a single group, but was a widespread habit among hunter-gatherer societies. Yet the marks tell us very little about the broader cultural systems that created them. A handprint records a body, not a belief, a trade, or a governance structure. It confirms that people cared enough to leave a trace, but it does not reveal how they organized, traded, or governed themselves. The personal nature of the imprint highlights the limits of the surviving archive. We can see who touched the stone, but the stories behind those touches remain lost. This realization pushes the investigation toward the everyday tools and materials that vanished without a trace. If a hand can survive for tens of thousands of years, what about the clothing, baskets, or wooden implements that shaped daily life? Those perishable technologies were essential to survival, yet they left almost no physical record, slipping silently beneath the archaeological surface. The hand stencil demonstrates humanity's innate desire to mark identity, a seed of memory that predates any written language. At the same time, it underscores a fundamental gap in the record. Personal presence is visible, but the complex systems that supported those individuals are often invisible. Recognizing this gap prepares us to ask what other crucial aspects of ancient life have disappeared because they were made of wood, hide, or fiber. Having seen how a single hand can speak across millennia, we now turn to the technologies that once defined daily existence: clothing, baskets, fire-making tools, and explore how their perishable nature has left the deep human archive almost blank. The hill of stone that first cracked the familiar ladder of civilization also reminds us that most of daily life never leaves a permanent mark. Before cities and tablets, people wrapped themselves in woven skins, carried baskets woven from reeds, and tended fire that warmed their evenings and cooked their meals. Those everyday tools were as essential to survival as the stone pillars we see at Göbekli Tepe, yet they have vanished from the archaeological record, leaving us with an incomplete picture of how early societies operated. Think of those vanished objects as stories told around a campfire. The words echo in memory, shape identities, and guide actions. But once the fire dies, the tale remains only in the listener's minds. In the same way, clothing, baskets, and fire carried meaning, skill, and social bonds, but they left no stone, no metal, no inscription to survive the millennia. The physical traces they produced are fragile. Animal hide decomposes, plant fibres rot, and ash disperses with the wind. Even when the material survives in exceptional conditions, it is usually reduced to a fragment that tells us little about its original form or the practices that created it. Archaeologists have learned this lesson from a handful of rare finds: a few preserved leather shoes from the high Andes, a handful of charred basket fragments in waterlogged sites, and occasional hearth residues are the exception rather than the rule. Experimental archaeology confirms the bias. When researchers recreate prehistoric clothing from goat hide or weave baskets from sedge, the artifacts disintegrate within a few years unless they are kept in airtight, moisture-free environments. Fire, too, leaves behind only burnt soil and charcoal, and those residues can be scattered or altered by later occupations. Because the materials decay so quickly, the record we inherit is heavily weighted towards stone, bone, and fired clay, those media that resist time more effectively than the very things that sustained daily life. This selective preservation creates a hidden layer of complexity. While the stone pillars at Göbekli Tepe reveal that people could organize massive communal labor, they do not tell us how those groups clothed themselves for long winters, how they stored gathered plant foods, or how they managed fire across seasons. Those missing details are not mere curiosities. They are the mechanisms that allowed societies to move, trade, and exchange knowledge long before any city walls rose. When the archaeological archive is silent about perishable technologies, the story of early organization is forced into a narrow frame, and we risk mistaking the visible surface for the whole structure. The silence itself becomes a pressure point. If the tools that shaped daily existence left no trace, how did early peoples coordinate the movement of ideas, materials, and people over hundreds of kilometers? The absence of clothing, baskets, and fire evidence forces us to ask what other forms of organization might have existed beyond the stone record. It suggests that the most influential aspects of prehistoric life, shared techniques, seasonal migrations, and long-distance exchange, could have been built on perishable foundations that simply did not fossilize. Thus, the missing perishable technologies underscore a fundamental limit of the archaeological archive. What survives is not always what mattered most. Recognizing this limit sharpens our inquiry, because every gap invites us to look for indirect clues, patterns of raw material sourcing, distribution of exotic stones, or changes in settlement placement that hint at the invisible networks that once linked distant groups. Only by acknowledging the blind spots can we begin to reconstruct the full tapestry of early human interaction. With that understanding, the next step is to follow the trail of movement itself. We will examine how early humans crossed vast distances, the routes they forged long before any written map, and what those pathways reveal about the organization of societies that left little behind. When sea levels fell during the last ice age, a broad coastal plain stretched from present-day Indonesia to the northern tip of Australia, forming the ancient landmass known as Sahul. This vast expanse existed roughly 65,000 years ago, linking islands and mainland into a single walkable surface. Archaeologists have uncovered stone tools and hearths on the western coast of New Guinea that date to around 64,000 years ago, confirming that people stepped onto the new continent well before the shoreline disappeared beneath the ocean. The earliest securely dated site on mainland Australia, at Majidbeeb, yields chipped stone points and ochre stains that are 37,000 years old, showing that humans had already settled far inland. Those early travellers carried fire, food, and stories across a landscape that bore no roads, borders, or maps. Imagine a group moving at night, guided by the stars, stopping at fresh water sources and sharing firelight with distant kin they had never met before. Their knowledge of seasonal winds, tidal patterns, and edible plants acted as a mental compass, allowing them to cross hundreds of kilometers without written directions. This mental map was built on repeated journeys, each return reinforcing a shared understanding of the terrain. The archaeological record reveals that these peoples exchanged distinctive stone tools and ornamental objects across great distances. Pebble-crafted bifaces found in northern Australia match lithic styles from islands thousands of kilometers away, suggesting a network of exchange that spanned the whole of Sahel. Likewise, red ochre pigments discovered at sites on opposite coasts share identical mineral compositions, indicating that the same pigment source was traded across the continent. Such material similarities imply that groups maintained long-term relationships, passing goods and knowledge along established routes. These routes functioned like invisible highways, built on memory, reciprocity, and the promise of mutual aid rather than on any written contract or state authority. Communities gathered at predictable seasonal camps, exchanged raw materials, and shared stories that reinforced social bonds. In the absence of written maps, the landscape itself became the map, marked by landmarks, waterholes, and the seasonal migrations of animals that guided human movement. This organic network allowed coordination on a scale that rivals later road systems, even though no stone road or signpost remains. The paradox is striking. An extensive, coordinated system of movement left almost no durable trace. While stone tools and pigment particles survive, the pathways they traversed have been erased by rising seas, wind, and the passage of time. The very success of these routes, relying on flexible, perishable knowledge rather than permanent infrastructure, makes them difficult for modern archaeology to detect. We can infer their existence only through scattered artifacts and subtle shifts in technology, not through grand highways or city walls. Understanding that organized, continent-spanning movement existed long before the first cities reshapes the mystery of what else remains hidden in the silent parts of the record. If people could coordinate travel and trade across Sahel without states or written maps, then many other forms of social organization may have flourished in similarly invisible ways. The pressure now shifts to identifying the faintest clues that hint at such networks, pushing us to look beyond the obvious stone monuments. The next step in this investigation turns to the most delicate of those clues, ancient footprints preserved in sediment. These fragile impressions offer a direct though fragile record of early movement, testing how far our evidence can reach into the hidden pathways of our ancestors. A set of ancient footprints emerges from the stone, a fragile trace of people who walked the world long before any city ever rose. Those impressions are the earliest sign that a group of humans moved together, left a mark and vanished again. Imagine trying to read a photograph that has cracked in many places. The picture is still there, but the edges are missing, the colours faded, and the story is incomplete. That is how scientists view the dates of these footprints. The cracks are the gaps in the sediment, the erosion, the limits of the dating methods, and the story we can piece together is only an approximation. The most celebrated example lies on a volcanic plain in Tanzania, where 3.6 million years ago, a pair of hominin feet pressed into soft ash. The prints show a toe-off shape that matches a bipedal gait. The fact is clear, a footprint exists. It is 3.6 million years old, and it was made by a creature walking upright. The interpretation is that an early ancestor of ours was already walking on two legs. The hypothesis is that this gait indicates a level of coordination that could support simple group movement, but it does not prove social organization. Further north, on the shores of Kenya, a set of deeper impressions dates to about 1.5 million years ago. The fact is that a larger footprint, longer than the earlier ones, was left in a lake-bed mud. Researchers measured the stride length and concluded a creature of roughly 30 kilograms made them. The interpretation suggests a more robust hominin, perhaps an early Homo. The hypothesis proposes that such a creature could have traversed longer distances in search of resources, hinting at a developing awareness of seasonal routes. Across the Atlantic, a more recent and highly contested set of prints appears in the white sands of New Mexico. The prints were uncovered in a layer of wind-blown dunes and were initially dated to about 23,000 years ago. The fact is that the prints show a series of shallow depressions matching a modern human foot. The interpretation is that they could belong to people who walked the desert at the end of the last ice age. The hypothesis, however, has sparked debate because the sedimentary context is complex and the dating relies on indirect methods. Some scholars argue the age could be several thousand years younger, while others defend the older estimate. The disagreement illustrates how fragile the evidence is when the surrounding material does not preserve a clear timestamp. These sites share a common thread. Each footprint is a delicate imprint preserved by unusual circumstances, and each date rests on a chain of assumptions. The bridge to the next part of our investigation is understanding why this uncertainty matters. If we cannot be sure when a foot touched the ground, we cannot map precisely how early humans moved across continents, nor can we gauge the speed of cultural development. The timing of these walks could shift our view of when groups began to travel together, share knowledge, or establish seasonal routes. The fragility of these traces deepens the mystery. The footprints exist, but they are isolated clues that cannot alone reveal the full pattern of early human life. Their existence proves that people were on the move, yet the lack of precise dates forces us to accept a broader, less defined timeline. This limitation reminds us that the ancient record is often a mosaic of partial pieces, each demanding careful placement before the picture becomes recognizable. What the footprints demonstrate is how easily early evidence can disappear. A footstep in soft mud may survive for millions of years, but a wooden walking stick, a woven basket, or a spoken story will not. The delicate nature of these prints raises a crucial question. How many other routes, gatherings, or rituals have been erased simply because the materials left no lasting mark? The next chapter of our journey looks to the sea. Rising waters after the last ice age flooded vast coastal plains, submerging entire landscapes that once hosted human activity. If the sea can drown whole settlements, it may also have swallowed countless fragile traces like the footprints we have just examined. By turning our gaze to those submerged coastlines, we can explore how the planet itself may have erased chapters of our ancestors' lives, leaving only the few impressions that survived against the odds. When the final glacial sheets melted, the world's coastlines did not simply creep upward, they surged. In a matter of centuries, the sea rose by roughly 120 meters, swallowing low-lying river deltas, fertile plains, and the very shorelines where early peoples had built their homes. Imagine entire villages disappearing beneath a tide that rose faster than a city could rebuild. Those drowned settlements are the first concrete anchor of our hidden archive. Think of the ancient landscape as a massive library of stone, bone, and memory. When the shelves are submerged, the books sink with them, their pages forever wet. The sea level surge acted like a flood that dragged an entire library off its shelves and dropped it onto the ocean floor. What remains on the surface are only the volumes that were already bound in stone or baked clay, monuments, pottery shards, and the occasional durable tool. The rest, the fragile scrolls of daily life, are gone, leaving gaps that look like empty shelves. Scientists have measured the rise by comparing ancient shoreline terraces with today's sea level. In the eastern Mediterranean, for example, the last ice age shoreline sits now 250 kilometers inland, beneath layers of sediment. In the North Sea, the Doggerland Plain once stretched from present-day Britain to the Netherlands, supporting hunter-gatherer camps that now lie under kilometers of water. Similar submerged paleo shorelines have been mapped off the coasts of Western Australia, the Caribbean and the Baltic, each telling a story of thriving communities that the waves erased. These underwater sites are tantalizing clues, but they do not automatically prove that complex cities once rose there. A submerged stone tool workshop tells us about technology. A buried hearth hints at daily life. Neither guarantees the presence of palaces, record-keeping tablets, or organized bureaucracy. The evidence is real, but it remains fragmentary, and the sea's appetite for preservation is selective. Here lies the tension that can pull our reasoning in two opposite directions. One temptation is to claim that the absence of evidence means nothing ever existed beyond the few stone monuments we can still see. The opposite temptation is to read the void as evidence of a hidden empire, a sophisticated civilization that vanished without a trace because the ocean hid it. Both extremes ignore the simple fact that the archive itself was physically erased. The sea does not discriminate between humble huts and grand temples. It simply drowns whatever was built on the shore. Understanding this physical erasure matters because it reshapes the question we are chasing. We now know that the visible start of civilization, cities, writing, monumental stone, may be just the tip of an iceberg, the part that survived a massive water-driven purge. The sea tells us that many cultures, perhaps even complex ones, could have lived and organized themselves along coastlines that are now underwater. That possibility remains open, but it does not confirm any particular hidden society. It merely highlights a blind spot in our record that we must treat with caution. So, as we turn from the drowned shoreline, we must remember the two wrong answers trap, assuming that nothing existed because we cannot see it, or assuming that an elaborate hidden world must have existed because the gaps feel uncomfortable. The next segment will lay out that very trap, showing how easy it is to slip into either extreme when the evidence is scarce. By keeping the balance, we keep the investigation honest and the mystery alive. Having examined how rising seas erased coastal settlements, we now step back to consider the logical error of reading absence as definitive proof. Imagine a library that burns to ash. The surviving shelves hold only a handful of volumes, while the countless scrolls that perished in the flames are gone forever. From the charred remnants, we might falsely conclude that the library once contained only those few books, or, conversely, that it once held an unimaginable treasure trove of knowledge. This is the two wrong answers trap that haunts every investigation of missing evidence. When archaeologists turn up an empty stone floor, one tempting conclusion is that nothing of importance ever happened there. The opposite temptation is to fill the void with grand speculation. Perhaps a hidden empire once thrived, its records erased by time. Both extremes clash with the hard reality of preservation. Organic materials, wood, hide, plant fibres, even spoken stories, decompose within decades or centuries once exposed. Only stone, fired clay and bone survive the millennia. The absence of these fragile traces does not prove a void, but it also does not guarantee a hidden abundance. Consider the perishable tools of early foragers. Microscopic wear on stone flakes shows they were used to cut meat and plant fibres, yet the actual baskets, clothing and shelters they manufactured have vanished. The same applies to fire-making knowledge. Charred hearths mark where fire burned, but the techniques of controlling temperature, maintaining embers through rain, and transferring fire between camps are invisible to us. Assuming that no fire-related expertise existed because we lack clay ovens would be as unfounded as assuming a secret fire cult thrived because we find a single ember. The episode remains anchored in the tangible traces we do possess: the monumental pillars of Göbekli Tepe, the ochre stains on shells, the hand stencils on cave walls, the submerged shorelines now beneath ocean water. At the same time, we acknowledge the gaps that no amount of imagination can fill. By keeping the focus on real, verifiable evidence while admitting uncertainty, we preserve the investigative integrity that guides the whole narrative. Shifting from abstract methodology, let us look at the everyday expertise that sustained hunter-gatherer societies for hundreds of thousands of years. These peoples knew which wild grains could be ground into flour, which roots offered reliable calories, and which seasonal migrations would bring game in abundance. They mastered the art of tracking animal footprints across varied terrain, reading subtle signs of wind, water, and predator presence. Their knowledge of fire allowed them to create smoke signals, harden wooden spears, and preserve meat for days. Each of these skills required coordinated learning, memory sharing, and communal practice. Yet they left no stone monuments to mark their existence. Recognizing the two wrong answers trap sharpens our investigation. It reminds us to treat absence not as definitive proof of emptiness, nor as evidence of a concealed empire, but as a prompt to seek the subtle, perishable footprints of human ingenuity. This disciplined stance prepares us to explore the next layer of the mystery, the practical knowledge that ordinary foragers carried in their hands, minds, and daily routines, and which never hardened into stone. What practical expertise did hunter-gatherers rely on that left no durable record? We turn now to that everyday knowledge. In the quiet of a late evening camp, the steady glow of a controlled fire tells a story that stone never can. Long before pottery or writing, human groups learned to coax sparks, tend embers, and direct flames across the landscape. Archaeological traces of hearths and charcoal layers show that fire was not a wild accident, but a deliberately managed resource, used to clear brush, attract game, and keep predators at bay. This ability to shape fire demonstrates a collective understanding of heat, wind, and fuel that required planning, communication, and shared responsibility. The skill matters because it reveals that people could coordinate labor and knowledge long before any monument stood, a clear sign of hidden intelligence. Think of that expertise as a mental toolbox carried by every hunter-gatherer. Just as a carpenter keeps a hammer and a set of nails ready for any repair, Ancient peoples stored a repertoire of techniques: how to start a spark, where to find dry tinder, how to keep a fire burning through rain. This toolbox was invisible to the eyes of later archaeologists, yet it guided daily survival. One vivid example comes from the African savanna, where early groups practiced selective burning to promote the growth of fresh grass shoots that attracted herds of antelope. By lighting thin strips of grass at the edge of a watering hole, they created a mosaic of fresh forage, while simultaneously clearing parasites and pests. The timing of these burns, often in the dry season just before the rains, required precise reading of weather patterns and animal behaviour. That timing mattered because it shows a sophisticated ecological awareness that coordinated community effort without leaving any stone marker. A second illustration appears in the temperate forests of Europe, where seasonal plant gathering demanded intimate knowledge of which bulbs, roots and berries were safe to eat and which were poisonous. Gatherers memorized the subtle color changes of leaves, the scent of sap, and the texture of bark to distinguish edible hazelnuts from bitter lookalikes. This knowledge was passed down through hands-on teaching and story, a form of oral curriculum that left no durable record. The ability to reliably harvest food each spring demonstrates a hidden layer of cultural memory that operated beneath the surface of the archaeological record. A third, equally telling practice involved the use of medicinal herbs to treat wounds and illnesses. In the Levant, residues of crushed willow bark, a source of natural salicylic compounds, have been identified on stone pestles dating back tens of thousands of years. Early healers recognized that chewing or grinding the bark reduced pain and slowed infection, a discovery that required careful observation of plant effects and experimental trial. This medicinal insight matters because it indicates systematic experimentation and knowledge sharing, hallmarks of complex cognition that never required a tablet to record. All of these skills, fire stewardship, plant selection, herbal remedy, fade quickly from the ground. Organic material decomposes, and the subtle gestures of teaching disappear with each generation. That is why the visible archive feels thin. It preserves only the hardest stone and clay, while the softer, yet equally vital practices vanish without a trace. The implication is clear: human societies could sustain intricate coordinated behaviour without ever building a city or carving a monument. Complexity does not depend on visible architecture. It can live in the shared mental tools of daily life. This realization expands the question of what early humans were capable of, pushing us to look beyond the stones to the invisible networks of knowledge. Understanding this hidden intelligence reshapes the limits of the visible archive and asks how such expertise was exchanged across groups. The next step is to follow those threads of shared know-how into the early exchange networks that linked distant bands, spreading ideas long before any written word. The hill of stone pillars once seemed an isolated mystery, but the surrounding world was already linked by threads of trade that stretched far beyond any single settlement. Imagine a hunter-gatherer who leaves a valley in the early dawn, carries a handcrafted stone blade across rivers, and returns with a polished piece of volcanic glass that originated hundreds of kilometers to the east. Archaeologists have uncovered obsidian flakes at sites in the pre-pottery Neolithic Levant, each piece chemically matching sources in the Anatolian highlands. That fact shows material moved across a landscape that otherwise lacked roads or wheeled transport. Interpretation of those finds suggests a network of exchange in which groups shared valuable resources without a central marketplace. Another concrete anchor appears in the form of marine shells discovered in inland burial pits of the same period. Those shells, harvested from the Mediterranean coast, ended up thousands of kilometers away in the arid plateaus of southeastern Anatolia. That fact demonstrates that people deliberately moved items that held no immediate survival value. The plain language translation of this pattern is simple. Communities traded items that signaled status, forged alliances, or encoded knowledge, even when the items themselves were not food or shelter. Further evidence comes from exotic lithic raw material such as basalt from the volcanic fields of the Taurus Mountains, found in the same layers as locally quarried limestone at Göbekli Tepe. That fact indicates that builders sourced stone from distant quarries, transporting it over rugged terrain. Interpretation of the basalt presence points to a shared pool of resources that required coordination among groups who did not live in the same permanent village. These exchanges created social bonds that functioned like a nervous system, allowing information, ideas and technologies to travel without a state apparatus. The calm analysis reveals that the pressure to cooperate could arise from mutual benefit, not from top-down command. Contrast this network-based organization with the traditional ladder model, where cities, kings, and writing are the sole engines of large-scale cooperation. The fact is that the earliest cities appear several millennia after the first evidence of long-distance material movement. The hypothesis, therefore, is that the human brain had already invented a method of large-scale coordination through reciprocal exchange, long before the emergence of urban bureaucracy. This hypothesis does not claim that every exchange implied a formal alliance, but it does suggest that the capacity to share valuable objects created a framework for shared meaning across groups. A plain language analogy helps. Think of a modern neighbourhood where neighbours swap tools and garden produce without a homeowners association. The same principle operated in the deep past, only with stone, shell, and pigment instead of drills and tomatoes. The value of recognising these networks is that they expand the pattern of early social complexity beyond the walls of a single monument. They raise new questions. What ideas travelled along these routes? How did the shared material culture influence the construction of sites like Göbekli Tepe? Answering those questions shifts the focus from a solitary hill to a web of relationships that predated any formal state. Now, with the picture of exchange networks clarified, we can revisit Göbekli Tepe. Seeing the monument through the lens of shared connectivity reveals that its massive pillars may have been erected not by a lone community, but by a coalition of distant groups bound together by trade and mutual obligation. The next step, then, is to examine how this coalition mindset altered the social dynamics on the hill, and what that tells us about the earliest forms of organised human effort. The battered hill of Göbekli Tepe reappears, this time framed by the deeper story we have already traced. Human bodies that walk the earth for hundreds of thousands of years, a mind that began to mark objects with meaning, and roots that stretched across continents long before any map was drawn. Imagine a dark stage suddenly illuminated by a brief spotlight. That flash of light is the stone circle we see rising from the darkness of pre-urban life, a moment when the effort of many people became visible, even though the surrounding machinery of cities and writing had not yet been built. The pillars, T-shaped and meticulously carved, sit atop a landscape already populated by ancient skeletons, ochre-stained shells, and scattered shells carried across seas. Those earlier traces tell us that groups were already moving, sharing knowledge, and assigning symbolic weight to objects. Göbekli Tepe thus fits the pattern. Bodies existed, minds expressed intention, and networks linked distant peoples. Yet, the site alone captures that coordination in stone. Now we must ask why that fleeting spotlight mattered at all. The answer lies in what comes after the flash, the steady glow of agriculture. When people began to sow grain and store surplus, their activities left behind durable layers of ash, charred husks, and pottery shards, each a permanent record of daily life. Those layers amplified the signal that Göbekli Tepe first offered in stone. The flash shows large-scale cooperation before any city wall or royal decree could explain it. It raises a sharper question. What later developments turned such cooperative gatherings into the unmistakable archaeological signatures of civilization? The answer points toward the ways food production reshaped human settlement and memory. Göbekli Tepe proves that coordinated labour and shared ritual could emerge without the infrastructure of a city, but it does not prove the existence of an organised state or empire. It demonstrates a capacity for collective effort that predates the administrative tools we usually associate with civilization. Understanding why that capacity later became easier to see requires looking at the changes in how people stored, counted, and recorded their harvests. So the next step of our investigation turns to the fields themselves. How did the advent of farming, the construction of granaries, and the need to track stored food increase the visibility of human complexity? By examining the early agricultural sites that followed Göbekli Tepe, we will see how the once dim spotlight grew into a steady, unmistakable beam across the archaeological record. When grain began to be cultivated, a new kind of trace entered the record of human activity. Archaeologists date the earliest systematic grain farming to around 12,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, the Yangtze Basin, and parts of Mesoamerica. The cultivation of wheat, barley, and rice required the creation of storage pits, silos, and communal granaries. These structures are made of stone, fired clay, or packed earth, materials that survive for millennia. A simple way to see the impact is to picture a pantry that never runs out. A family that can draw food from a stored surplus no longer needs to move nightly in search of wild plants. The result is that a settlement can remain in one place for many seasons. Archaeological layers at sites such as Çatalhöyük show continuous occupation for several centuries, built on the foundation of stored grain. Storing surplus grain also allowed populations to grow larger than the immediate foraging capacity would permit. Evidence from early villages indicates house sizes expanding and new dwellings appearing alongside existing structures. Larger groups needed more coordinated effort to protect the stored food, leading to the development of communal guards and simple fortifications. The health consequences of farming appear in skeletal remains. Bones from early agriculturalists show a higher frequency of dental caries and wear patterns compared to hunter-gatherer counterparts. These changes suggest a diet richer in carbohydrates but lower in diverse nutrients. The same remains also reveal increased rates of anemia, likely caused by reliance on a limited range of cultivated crops. Social organisation shifted as well. The need to allocate stored grain gave rise to early forms of record-keeping. Clay tokens and tally sticks appear in the archaeological layers that follow the first permanent stores. These artefacts represent an emerging administrative layer, a way to track who contributed what to the communal pantry. If you imagine a stone wall that endures while a wooden hut decays, the pattern becomes clear. Durable storage vessels and fortified enclosures survive the ages, while the daily tools of cooking and clothing leave almost no trace. This difference is the core of visibility bias. The things that survive are not necessarily the things that mattered most. Agriculture, therefore, does not invent complexity from nothing. The human mind already possessed social coordination, seasonal rituals, and shared knowledge before the first grain was sown. What farming did was amplify those existing capacities, turning a quiet, mobile network into a louder, stationary one that leaves a clearer imprint for future eyes. What changes in your view is the realization that the archaeological record is louder where stone and clay dominate, not where ideas first sparked. The presence of granaries tells us that people were already organizing around shared meaning. The storage simply made that organization easier to see. It does not prove that farming alone created civilization, only that it made certain aspects of civilization more visible. The lingering question, then, is how much earlier social complexity remained hidden, because it left no durable trace. If the storage of grain turned a subtle network into a visible monument, what other invisible systems might have existed before the first pantry? Next, we will examine how the invention of writing turned this louder archive into a lasting record, linking stored surplus to the birth of administrative counting. After exploring how agriculture amplified visibility, we now turn to the earliest administrative records that turned memory into tangible accounts. The first clay marks appear on soft, sun-baked tablets, dating to roughly 8000 BCE in the fertile valleys of southern Mesopotamia. Archaeologists have uncovered dozens of these tablets, each bearing a series of shallow incisions that run across the surface like tiny ridges. These incisions are not decorative. They are deliberate scratches that record quantities. One common pattern consists of a short line followed by a cluster of parallel marks. Researchers interpret the single line as a label for a particular commodity, grain, dates, or perhaps a herd of goats, and the parallel marks as a count of individual units. To see how this works, imagine a modern grocery list. When you shop, you might write a quick tally of apples, a vertical line for the item, then 3 short strokes to show 3 pieces. The ancient tablet uses the same visual language, except the tally is pressed into clay before any alphabet existed. The purpose of these markings was practical. By pressing a count into clay, a villager could keep track of stored grain without relying on oral memory, which could fade or be contested. The tablet served as a communal ledger, a reference that anyone could consult to verify that a household had contributed its share to the shared store. From these simple records, a more complex administrative system emerged. The incised marks evolved into symbols that represented categories, and later into signs that denoted ownership or debt. This shift marks the first moment when human memory moved from the brain to a durable medium, allowing obligations to be enforced across weeks and generations. Writing, however, does not create thought. It merely illuminates it. The clay tablets act like a spotlight that highlights specific transactions: who gave grain, who received it, while leaving countless other aspects of life in shadow. Ritual gatherings, seasonal migrations, and the nuanced social bonds that held groups together remain invisible because they left no durable imprint. Thus, the spotlight of writing reveals a narrow slice of a broader, older human capacity for organization. The ability to coordinate, to share knowledge about food sources, and to maintain social cohesion existed long before any mark was pressed into clay. Those capacities are inferred from other evidence, burials, pigment use, and long-distance exchange, but they do not appear on the clay surface. The early tablets prove that memory can become administration. They show that societies were already capable of abstracting quantities and recording obligations, a prerequisite for later complexities such as law or taxation. Yet they do not prove that all complex thought began with writing. They simply demonstrate one pathway by which oral traditions were made permanent. Having seen how a simple tally transforms into a record of economic exchange, we now examine a broader definition of civilization, one that focuses on function rather than on the labels of city, state, or script. This perspective will allow us to trace the hidden layers of human organization that predate the surviving archives. Building on the previous discussion of writing as a spotlight, we now step back to ask what civilization actually does, not what it is called. Imagine a toolbox that any group can open when a problem arises. The tools inside are not a brand name. They are the practical abilities that let people solve shared challenges. Those tools become the functions we can see emerging long before the first city-state label appears. The first tool is collective memory. Long before ink on clay, people invested effort in remembering who had died, where food was stored, and which songs marked the seasons. Burials at Kafza, hand stencils on cave walls, and the careful placement of ochre all point to purposeful acts of remembrance. The act of digging a grave, for example, is a clear investment of labour in an individual who can no longer contribute food or fire. That labour tells us memory was already a social priority. The second tool is a shared place. Göbekli Tepe is a striking example of a communal gathering site that predates any known urban infrastructure. Massive stone pillars stand in a circle that required coordinated planning, quarrying, and transport. The very existence of such a place shows that groups could agree on a location worth returning to, even when no permanent settlement surrounded it. The stone circles functioned as a meeting point, a venue for rituals, and a focal memory anchor for many seasons. The third tool is long-distance routes. The earliest evidence of people reaching the Sahul landmass, modern Australia and New Guinea, demonstrates that ancient groups navigated coastlines, crossed water, and shared knowledge about resources far beyond their immediate home range. The spread of stone tools and shell ornaments across thousands of kilometres indicates that information and material moved along invisible highways long before any written map existed. The fourth tool is storage of surplus. In the early pre-pottery Neolithic, archaeologists have uncovered pits and simple silos dug into the ground. These features held grain, nuts, or dried fish for later consumption. By keeping food in one place, societies could plan for leaner periods, support larger gatherings, and create a stable basis for repeated rituals at places like Göbekli Tepe. The presence of storage therefore signals an early form of economic coordination. These four functions, memory, place, roots, and storage, appear repeatedly in the archaeological record, each predating the formal institutions of kings, law codes, and written administration. When we speak of civilization as a label, city, writing, monarchy, we risk overlooking the underlying mechanisms that made those later structures possible. The label-based view is useful for cataloguing what survived in stone and clay, but it is not the only way to define a complex society. The functional model does not claim that a hidden empire built the pillars at Göbekli Tepe, nor does it assert that every early group possessed the full suite of modern institutions. Instead, it reframes the question: what set of capabilities allowed people to organize, remember, travel, and store before the first tablets were pressed? By shifting focus from titles to tasks, we expand the investigative space while keeping the claims grounded in concrete evidence. This redefinition also clarifies the limits of our argument. We can say with confidence that collective memory, shared gathering places, long-distance exchange routes, and surplus storage existed in various forms across deep time. We cannot say, however, that every community practiced all four functions simultaneously, nor that these functions alone constitute a fully formed state. The model is a lens, not a proof of a lost empire. Now that we have outlined the functional toolbox of early societies, we must test its robustness. The toughest test comes from the strongest skeptical objection. Do the pressure marks we have assembled truly support a broader model, or do they simply reflect isolated practices that do not add up to a coherent pre-civilization system? The next segment will confront that objection head-on, drawing the line between what our functional view can explain and what it cannot. What if the very evidence we have gathered only creates pressure, never proof, of a lost empire hidden beneath the stone? The excavations at Göbekli Tepe reveal massive T-shaped limestone pillars, yet they sit on a hill with no surrounding settlement, no permanent dwellings, and no traces of storage pits or administrative buildings. Radiocarbon dates place the earliest construction phase at around 11,000 years before the Common Era, well before any known city-state system. In the same layers, archaeologists find only occasional flint tools and animal bones, but no pottery, no written tags, and no signs of a bureaucratic hierarchy. These gaps matter because they remove the usual hallmarks of a complex polity. Without continuous habitation, there is no evidence that a stable labour force lived nearby to maintain the site. The absence of pottery or clay tablets means no durable record of trade, law, or taxation that would betray an organised state. And the ambiguous carvings on the pillars, geometric motifs and animal reliefs, cannot be read as a definitive script or official iconography. The picture that remains is one of a gathering place, not a capital. Imagine a candle flickering in a dark room. A candle gives light, but it does not illuminate the whole house. The pressure that Göbekli Tepe creates is like that candle. It signals something important happening, yet it does not reveal the full structure of the building. A blazing fire would scorch the walls and leave ash everywhere, offering unmistakable evidence of a larger hearth. The current site, however, stays modest, its light confined to the stone circles. The main limits of the evidence fall into three clear categories. First, the lack of a continuous settlement means we cannot trace a chain of occupation that would link the monument to a broader urban landscape. Second, the symbolic carvings are ambiguous. They could represent ritual, myth, or simple decoration, but they do not constitute a decipherable language that records decisions or laws. Third, the complete absence of any written record, no clay tablets, no inscribed stones, means we have no direct account of who built the pillars, why they were built, or how the labour was organised. These boundaries are not dead ends. They are the necessary guardrails of honest investigation. By acknowledging where the stone stops speaking, we keep the inquiry focused on what truly remains to be explained. The question shifts from did a hidden empire exist to what kinds of social organisation could produce such monuments without leaving the usual signatures of a state. This reframing sharpens the mystery rather than diluting it. When the objection is stated plainly, it trims away the fantasy of a secret kingdom, but it also clears the view for a deeper puzzle. Without the presumption of an empire, we must ask how many people could coordinate the transport and placement of multi-ton stones, what shared belief or purpose could bind them, and what alternative structures, ritual gatherings, seasonal feasts, communal labour exchanges, might have existed. The pressure of the stone persists, but the shape of the answer changes, becoming a question about collective intention rather than hidden rulership. Understanding this objection matters because it preserves the credibility of the whole investigation. If we were to ignore these limits, the narrative would crumble under scholarly scrutiny, and the audience would lose trust. By confronting the hardest doubt head-on, we demonstrate that the mystery is built on solid, albeit incomplete, foundations. It also leaves room for the later synthesis. The surviving fragments can still be assembled into a coherent pattern that tells us something profound about early human organisation. Now that the strongest skeptical challenge has been laid out, we can bring together all the surviving fragments – monument, body, pigment, burial, art, roots, drowned shorelines, and early writing – into a single pattern. This assembly will reveal how the visible surface of history emerges from a deeper, more complex human archive. Göbekli Tepe rises from the Anatolian plateau as a ring of massive stone circles, each built from T-shaped limestone pillars and dated to roughly 10,000 years before Christ. The Jebel Irhoud skulls, discovered in Morocco, push the appearance of anatomically modern humans back to 315,000 years ago. At Blombos Cave, researchers have recovered ochre-stained shells and stone tools that reveal deliberate pigment processing around 100,000 years ago. The Kafse burial in present-day Israel contains a carefully arranged human skeleton, accompanied by red ochre, dated to roughly 120,000 years ago. Deep within the Göbekli Cave, vivid animal paintings and abstract markings survive on limestone walls, their creation estimated at 32,000 years before Christ. Early humans traversed the ancient land bridge that once connected Africa and Australia, leaving scattered stone tools that trace a migration into Sahul some 65,000 years ago. Rising seas after the last ice age submerged vast coastal plains, erasing settlements that once dotted shorelines now hidden beneath meters of water. Finally, the earliest clay tablets from Mesopotamia bear simple tally marks and proto-writing, appearing only around 5,000 years before Christ. Imagine these 8 discoveries as scattered puzzle pieces spread across a dimly lit table. Each piece, on its own, hints at a larger picture, but only when they are gathered do the edges begin to align, revealing a form that's recognizable yet still incomplete. The stone circles, ancient bones, coloured pigments, buried bodies, painted walls, distant footprints, vanished coastlines, and clay marks together form a mosaic of early human activity that stretches far beyond the familiar ladder of farms, villages, cities, and writing. Göbekli Tepe adds pressure to the standard ladder by showing that large-scale communal construction occurred before any known urban bureaucracy. The Jebel Irhoud fossils add depth, demonstrating that modern human bodies existed for hundreds of thousands of years before written records appeared. The ochre workshops at Blombos indicate purposeful symbolic behaviour long before scripts were invented. The Kafse burial reflects a willingness to invest labour in memory for individuals who could not repay that effort. Chauvet's paintings prove that visual storytelling survived while the spoken narratives that created them have been lost. The Sahul migration routes illustrate coordinated long-distance movement without maps or states. Submerged coastlines remind us that entire settlements may have vanished beneath the sea, leaving no stone to speak for them. The early clay marks show that once societies began storing surplus, the desire to record transactions amplified the visibility of their actions. These fragments do not collectively prove that a hidden empire once ruled the world. Rather, they demonstrate a consistent pattern. Organised groups capable of large projects, symbolic expression, and long-range coordination existed long before the durable artefacts of cities and writing made their presence obvious. The pattern is stronger than any single piece, yet it still leaves vast swathes of human experience unrecorded, hidden beneath perishable materials and submerged landscapes. Understanding this pattern reshapes how we view civilization. Instead of a straight ladder that begins with agriculture, then cities, then writing, we see a layered archive where the visible surface marks only the moments when human activity left durable traces. The deeper layers, bodies, pigments, burials, art, roots, and lost coastlines, suggest that the capacities for cooperation, memory, and meaning were already in place, waiting for the technologies of storage and inscription to make them visible. With this synthesis in mind, we now turn to the core convergence statement that ties all the evidence together. The human body appeared long before the surviving archive, the mind fashioned symbols before writing ever recorded them, and organised networks existed before cities ever rose. This formulation will become the final model that guides the conclusion of our investigation. What if the story of humanity begins not with the first record, but with the first traces that survived long enough to be seen? That question rests on a simple pattern we have been gathering. Bodies appear long before any archive, minds leave marks before writing, and organised groups move before cities ever rise. A human body, measured in bone, can be dated to 315,000 years ago at Jebel Irhoud, far earlier than the first written tablets. That fact tells us that anatomically modern people walked the earth for hundreds of thousands of years before any script was ever carved. An interpretation follows. The long span of silent existence implies that memory, language, and social bonds must have been carried in ways that left no durable imprint. A mind can be seen in the deliberate use of red ochre at Blombos Cave, where processed pigment dates to about 100,000 years ago. The fact is that ochre was ground, mixed, and applied to shells and stone tools. The interpretation is that early peoples chose to give ordinary objects symbolic meaning, a behaviour that precedes any recorded language. A hypothesis then emerges. If symbolic intent existed, then the cognitive foundations of culture were already in place long before the first signs were ever scratched onto clay. Organization appears in the repeated movement of peoples across ancient seas. The fact is that the Sahul land bridge connected present-day Australia and New Guinea, and evidence of human occupation on the northern coast of Australia dates to at least 65,000 years ago. The interpretation is that groups coordinated long journeys, shared knowledge of routes, and returned to familiar places without any central government or written map. A hypothesis follows. If such networks existed, then the capacity to organize large groups was not a later invention of urban bureaucracy. The hill of Göbekli Tepe, with its massive T-shaped pillars erected around 11,000 years ago, provides a concrete anchor for the pattern. The fact is that hunter-gatherer groups gathered labour to raise stone circles in a region lacking permanent villages. The interpretation is that the social incentive to assemble at a shared ritual place required coordination comparable to that of later cities, even though no streets, walls, or kings were present. All these strands, deep-time bodies, symbolic pigment, far-reaching roots, and monumental gatherings, converge on a single insight. The pattern does not claim a hidden empire. It simply shows that the capacities we call civilization were already functioning in different forms many millennia before the first clay tablet ever recorded a transaction. The real surprise, then, is not that an advanced lost kingdom existed, but that complex organization, shared meaning, and collective memory were woven into daily life far earlier than the archaeological spotlight usually allows. The pressure marks we have examined prove that humanity possessed the building blocks of civilization: cooperative labor, symbolic thought, and long-distance exchange, long before the visible ladder of farms, villages, cities, and writing was ever built. Understanding this pattern reshapes the viewer's mental model. History no longer looks like a neat staircase starting with agriculture and writing. It resembles a layered surface where only the topmost stones remain visible, while a deeper, richer substrate lies beneath, largely erased by time. Now that the core pattern is clear, we can turn to how those ancient capacities still echo within us today, shaping modern needs for community, meaning, and shared places even in a world dominated by digital archives. We have long traced how the pattern of body before archive, mind before writing, and organization before cities reshapes the story of humanity's earlier steps. That same pattern still pulses through the lives we lead today, even if the stone pillars have been replaced by glass screens and the communal hearth by a shared Wi-Fi network. In the ancient world, people gathered at a single place to secure food, protect each other, and remember those who had passed. In modern neighborhoods, community gardens perform a similar function. Neighbors pool seeds, tools, and labor to grow vegetables that feed several families, while the garden itself becomes a place where people meet, exchange stories, and watch the seasons change together. The garden's rows of lettuce and tomatoes are not just crops. They are a living reminder of how cooperation once built monuments on distant hills. Beyond food, the ancient drive to preserve knowledge finds a clear echo in today's open-source software movement. Programmers around the globe contribute code to public repositories, each adding a line that improves a program used by millions. The version control history records who wrote what, but the true value lies in the collective memory of the community, which can rebuild and adapt the software long after any single contributor has stopped working. This distributed archive mirrors the way early peoples passed stories and techniques orally, ensuring that essential skills survived even without stone tablets. Security, another timeless concern, now often takes the form of emergency preparedness kits stored in closets and garages. Families assemble supplies, water, food rations, flashlights, and first aid kits so that they can weather storms, power outages, or other disruptions. The act of setting aside resources for an uncertain future reflects the same instinct that led prehistoric groups to construct sturdy stone circles, trusting that a shared space would protect them when danger loomed. These modern practices illustrate a continuity of purpose, securing sustenance, safeguarding collective memory, and protecting against risk. While the materials have changed, the underlying motivations remain unchanged. The ancient desire to gather, to remember, and to prepare still shapes how we organize our societies, even if the visible artifacts are now digital rather than stone. Seeing this bridge between past and present keeps the mystery alive. It reminds us that the patterns we uncover in the archaeological record are not isolated curiosities, but the roots of behaviors that continue to define us. Recognizing this link does not prove a hidden empire. Instead, it highlights how deep-seated human drives can produce lasting structures, whether they survive as monolithic pillars or as lines of code on a screen. The next step is to turn our attention to the many unnamed innovators whose expertise forged the world we inherit. Their skills, fire-making, plant identification, tool sharpening, left few durable marks, yet they shaped the course of human history. In the following chapter, we will honour these invisible geniuses whose quiet mastery persists in the foundations of our modern world. Following the discussion of how everyday expertise sustained ancient societies, we now turn to honouring the unnamed innovators behind those skills. Archaeologists have uncovered fragments of woven plant fibres at sites dating back 30,000 years. Those fibres reveal that people were already mastering basketry long before any stone monument was erected. The existence of such fragile textiles demonstrates a sophisticated knowledge of material properties and knotting techniques. It shows that early humans possessed practical ingenuity that left no lasting stone record. Think of a craftsman whose workshop vanished, leaving only the finished products scattered across the ground. In this analogy, the tools and blueprints are lost to time, while the impact of the work persists in the ways people lived. This plain language picture helps us see how everyday inventions can shape societies without ever appearing in the archaeological archive. It translates the abstract idea of lost skills into something tangible, a vanished toolbox that once held the means to create clothing, containers, and fireproof shelters. Evidence of perishable technologies includes remnants of animal hide garments preserved in the mineral layers of ancient burial pits. These garments indicate that people could fashion clothing suitable for varied climates, a crucial adaptation for expanding into new territories. The presence of fire pit ash layers with distinct charcoal composition points to controlled fire management and the likely use of hearths for cooking and warmth. Chemical residues on stone tools show that early humans processed plant oils, suggesting an early form of leather treatment and waterproofing. Together, these findings illustrate a suite of technologies that organized daily life and enabled long-distance movement, even though none of them survived in stone. By linking these hidden skills to the broader pattern of organization, we see that social cohesion could arise from shared practical knowledge as much as from monumental architecture. The perishable technologies acted as invisible threads, weaving communities together through common practices. This connection reinforces the idea that early complexity was not limited to visible stone structures, but also rested on the routine expertise that sustained everyday survival. In contrast, the archaeological record is replete with grand stone pillars, carved altars, and massive enclosures, while evidence of everyday innovations is scarce. This imbalance creates a skewed picture where monumental labour appears dominant, yet the scarcity of daily tools suggests a vast, unseen layer of human achievement. The question therefore becomes, what else remains hidden beneath the surface of our current knowledge, and how might those unseen contributions have shaped the trajectory of early societies? Recognizing the invisible contributions of unnamed innovators expands our understanding of early complexity without overstating the evidence. It invites us to appreciate the depth of human ingenuity that operated beyond the reach of stone and clay, while still acknowledging the limits of what the archaeological record can confirm. This balanced perspective keeps the investigation grounded and opens space for further inquiry into the subtle forces that drove prehistoric life. With this broader view of hidden expertise, we move toward the closing visual tableau, a lingering image of the hill crowned by ancient pillars, a solitary handprint on a cave wall, and a shoreline now submerged beneath the sea. These enduring symbols capture the mystery that remains, inviting the viewer to contemplate the silent stories of those who built, crafted, and survived long before their traces could be written in stone. What if the history we can read is merely the top layer of a far older hidden landscape? Imagine a thick book whose final pages are the only ones still bound, while the earlier chapters have been lost to time, water, and decay. That thin, surviving surface is what our archaeological record often looks like. A handful of stone pillars, a handful of polished bones, a few painted walls, and a handful of clay tablets. Beneath it stretches a deeper world of human bodies, shared ideas, and long-range journeys that left almost no durable trace. The monument on the hill at Göbekli Tepe reminds us how a community could gather, plan, and move massive stone pillars, long before the first city-state appeared. The skull from Jebel Irhoud tells us that anatomically modern humans were walking the earth for hundreds of thousands of years before any writing ever existed. Red ochre ground into shells at Blombos, intentional burials at Kafse, and the animal paintings deep within Chauvet show that symbolic thought and memory were already woven into daily life. A solitary hand stencil pressed onto a cave wall acts like a signature, a personal imprint that survived while the language that might have accompanied it vanished. The routes that carried peoples across the ancient continent of Sahul and the coastlines that later sank beneath rising seas illustrate how knowledge and exchange moved long before maps or governments could record them. Finally, the earliest clay marks and tablets record a moment when humanity chose to fix numbers, names, and transactions in a medium that would outlast wood, hide, and bone. All these threads converge on the same pattern. Human organization, meaning, and movement existed well before the artifacts that survive today could capture them. The visible start of civilization, cities, writing, monumental architecture, does not mark the beginning of complex humanity. It marks the point at which those complexities became legible to us. The archive's spotlight shining on stone and clay simply missed the earlier chapters written in song, in shared roots, and in the countless hands that built shelters, crafted pigments, and navigated coastlines now hidden beneath water. Returning to the question that opened our journey, we see that the answer is not a single hidden empire or a forgotten technology, but a recognition that what we see is only the surface of a vast layered human story. The pressure marks we examined, monument, body, symbol, root, sea, and script, are not isolated curiosities. They are the edges of a deeper tapestry that continues to shape us. By acknowledging the limits of the surviving surface, we change the way we view the past, not as a neat ladder that starts with farms and ends with empires, but as a landscape where many footholds existed long before the first stone tablet was laid down. Now, step back from the analysis and let the image linger. Picture the hill where the pillars of Göbekli Tepe once rose, the faint handprint left on a dark cave wall, and the shoreline that now rests beneath quiet, cold water. These 3 points, stone, skin, and sea, summarize a story that stretches far beyond the dates we can write down. The hill speaks of collective effort, the handprint of a single human presence, and the drowned shoreline of a world that has slipped away. Together they form a quiet tableau, a reminder that history's visible start is only a surface, and that beneath it lies the deeper, enduring pulse of humanity. We return now to the hill of stone pillars that opened our investigation. The pillars rise from the earth like silent witnesses to an ancient gathering. In plain terms, the hill becomes a metaphor for the surviving surface of human history. It stands above the layers that have long since vanished beneath time's relentless tide. Beside the hill, a solitary handprint is etched into the ancient rock. That imprint is a personal signature left before any name could be recorded. It reminds us that individuals once reached across centuries simply by touching stone. The handprint, like the hill, marks a point where memory survived without ink. Further away, the drowned shoreline hints at a world now hidden beneath water. Rising seas after the last ice age erased coastal villages that once thrived there. We do not add new findings, only recall the visual impressions already presented. The hill, handprint, and shoreline together compose a quiet tableau of persistence. Each element persists because stone and water preserve what softer materials could not. Their endurance offers a clue that some aspects of humanity outlasted fragile traces. These images return us to the central claim that the visible start of civilization is merely a surface. The surface we see is bright because stone and clay survived, not because they began everything. Yet beneath that bright layer, countless voices remain mute, their stories lost to the depths. That silence invites us to wonder rather than to demand definitive answers. Our curiosity becomes a gentle probe, feeling for the shape of what cannot be heard. Remember, history begins where the archive becomes visible, not where humanity first imagined. The hill, the handprint, and the drowned shore illustrate that principle with quiet clarity. They show how stone, skin, and sea each preserve fragments of a deeper story. No single artifact can claim the whole narrative, but together they suggest a pattern. The pattern tells us that organized thought, shared places, and roots predate the first written tablets. Thus, the visible beginnings are merely the first pages we can still read today. Let these images linger in your mind as the night deepens around you. Allow the hill's silhouette, the handprint's imprint, and the silent shore to settle. They remain as quiet witnesses to a past that still whispers beneath the surface. In this quiet pause, the mystery stays open, inviting future explorers to listen. The story ends here, but the hill, handprint, and shore continue their silent dialogue. Even without words, the weight of the stone speaks of collective effort across generations. The faint curve of the shoreline tells a story of lands lost to rising waters. Each ripple of memory carries the imprint of people who once walked those ancient paths. Our investigation has traced those paths only as far as the surviving fragments allow. Beyond them, the ocean of time keeps its deeper secrets, patient and undisturbed.